3 people were standing at my front door at 7:12 in the morning. No greeting, no smiles. Just a sheet of paper in hand, and the kind of look people wear when they think they've just been handed the power over life and death. Karen Whitmore stepped forward. Her hair was set so perfectly it looked like even the wind would need permission to touch it. She glanced past my shoulder, straight toward the backyard, where the well stood quietly, like a sentry on duty. "We received a report," she said, her voice cold as metal, "that you are operating an unapproved private well system." Unapproved. Those 2 words dropped like a stone thrown into a still lake. I looked at her, then at the paper, then back at her. That well wasn't something I dug in the middle of the night. It had been surveyed by a county groundwater engineer. It was permitted in writing. It passed safety inspections. I had put nearly $20,000 of my retirement savings into it. Every steel pipe, every pressure valve, every foot of wiring was installed to code. But standing in front of Karen, none of that seemed to exist. "Remove it within 30 days, she said without blinking. "Otherwise you will be fined $200 per day." The 2 people behind her nodded in perfect rhythm, like shadows. In that moment, I felt something familiar. Not anger, not fear. The feeling you get when someone underestimates you to a dangerous degree. They didn't know who I was. They didn't know what I had done. In their eyes, I was just a 58-year-old man, living alone at the end of the subdivision, someone who liked gardening and never showed up to the community barbecue. They thought I was weak. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply nodded, took the paper, and said, "Thank you for the notice." Karen paused slightly. She had probably expected a debate, an outburst, but I just stood there, hand on the door, morning sunlight spilling across the porch steps. When they turned and walked away, I watched the white SUV roll down the driveway. The engine growled, then faded into the distance. Not one of them looked back. I closed the door. Not hard, just enough for the latch to settle into place. In the kitchen, the coffee pot was still warm. I poured myself another cup slowly and looked out the window toward the backyard. The well stood there, no higher than my chest, painted light gray, its steel cap reflecting the morning light. Many people in this neighborhood believe in the centralized HOA water system. They believe in the pipes buried deep underground, in the electric pumps housed in the utility station on the east side. They believe in dependency. I don't. 30 years in construction taught me one thing. Every system has a weakness. And when it collapses, the one who prepared ahead of time does not panic. I walked into my study and opened the black metal cabinet. Inside was a thick folder. The well drilling permit, county inspection reports, email confirmations from the Water Resources Department. Each document, neatly clipped, dated in my own handwriting. I placed the folder on the desk. They thought I had dug a random hole in my yard. They didn't know I had once overseen emergency water infrastructure projects in areas devastated by storms. They didn't know I had designed backup systems for coastal facilities when main lines were destroyed. They didn't know I had seen an entire town lose water within hours. And they certainly didn't know that this summer, rainfall in this region had dropped to the lowest level in 40 years. That night, an email from the HOA arrived. The subject line was bold, "Violation of community standards." The message was long, citing clauses about infrastructure uniformity. I read it all. Then, I printed a copy, not to protest, but to prepare. The next morning, I called the county office. I reconfirmed the status of my permit. I asked about the current groundwater levels. I took notes on every answer. My heartbeat was steady, my mind clear. Outside, my neighbor's sprinkler was still running, watering a lush green lawn under the sun. They didn't know the town reservoir was dropping inch by inch every week. They didn't know the HOA's central pump had been operating near overload since last year. Karen certainly didn't know. Or maybe she did, and believed everything would be fine. I stepped into the backyard and placed my hand on the rim of the well. The metal felt cool against my palm. The pump vibrated softly, steady, and rhythmic. Water flowed through the filtration system, into the storage tank, consistent as breathing. "Remove it within 30 days. I smiled, a smile no one saw. They thought I was breaking the rules. They didn't understand that I was holding on to something they would soon need more than any bylaw. And when the drought truly arrived, when their faucets began to sputter and breathe out air, they would remember this morning. They would remember the man they thought was small. And then the story would no longer be about an unapproved well. It would be about who truly controls the flow of water. The violation notice was taped directly to my garage door at 8 in the morning. No envelope, no discretion, just a bright red stamp and the words, "Ongoing violation, $200 per day." They wanted to shame me in front of the entire neighborhood. I stood there watching the paper flap in the wind, hearing my own heartbeat, slow and heavy. Not out of fear, but because I understood this tactic very well. Apply pressure, make someone lose their composure, force them to tear down what they built with their own hands. I did not tear the notice down right away. I went inside, washed my hands, made coffee, and waited for my breathing to steady. Then I opened the safe. The folder lay on the table, thick and heavy like an oath. The county-issued well drilling permit, the groundwater survey report, the electrical safety inspection record, the email confirmation from the Water Resources Department. Each document arranged in chronological order, marked in black ink in my own handwriting. I sat down and wrote a letter. Not angry, not sarcastic, just precise and cold. I cited the relevant clause in the HOA regulations. There was no line prohibiting a private well if it had been properly permitted by the appropriate authority. I attached copies of my permit. I requested that they specify the legal basis for the fines. At the end of the letter, I signed my full name, no abbreviation. When I brought the envelope to the post office and sent it by certified mail, the clerk joked, "HOA trouble again?" I gave a small smile. Just a matter of principle. That evening, the reply email came faster than I expected. Karen did not call. She did not knock on my door. She sent an official notice from the board. The board reserves the right to interpret regulations in the best interest of the community. Interpret, a soft word used to conceal rigid power. They did not argue about my permit. They avoided it. Instead, they talked about infrastructure uniformity and the risk of setting a precedent. I read it again and again. Then I laughed. They were not afraid of the well. They were afraid of precedent. If one person could control his own water source, others could too. And when that happened, their authority would thin out like paper. The next morning, I saw two neighbors standing in front of my house, staring toward the well. They were whispering. When they saw me step outside, they fell silent. One man about my age scratched his head. "I heard you're getting fined over that thing." I nodded. He looked at the well like it was something dangerous. Karen said it wasn't approved. I did not argue. I simply said one sentence. "It's permitted by the county. I have the paperwork." His eyes shifted from suspicion to hesitation. Rumors spread faster than the wind. In the neighborhood Facebook group, people were talking. Some said I was breaking the rules. Some asked whether they could drill their own wells. Others claimed I was going against the community. Karen posted a long message emphasizing that the board had to protect unity. I read her words and realized something. She believed I was just a stubborn old man. She did not know I had worked with contract attorneys for 20 years on construction projects. She did not know I understood every gap in a clause. She did not know I had opened a separate account and transferred the entire projected fine amount into it, just in case they decided to take legal action. I was not avoiding the fight. I was preparing for it. 1 week passed. The fine notices kept coming. $200 per day. The accumulated amount rising like a countdown clock they thought would intimidate me. But every night, when I switched on the pump system and heard the water surge powerfully through the pipes, I felt a strange calm. I was not dependent on them, and they were beginning to sense it. At the board meeting that month, Karen mentioned my name in front of all the residents. Some individuals believe they stand above community regulations. The room fell silent. Eyes turned toward me. I stood up. No raised voice, no trembling. "I do not stand above the regulations," I said. "I comply with county law. If the HOA wants to change the bylaws, then amend them through a lawful vote. But as it stands, I am not in violation." There was murmuring. A few people nodded. Karen tightened her grip on the stack of papers in her hand. She had not expected that tone. Calm, clear, impossible to dismantle. The meeting ended in tension. As I walked out to the parking lot, I heard two men behind me whisper, "He knows exactly what he's doing." Yes, they thought I was trying to protect a well. In truth, I was protecting a principle. And deep down, I knew something they had not yet realized. The town reservoir had dropped to its lowest level in decades. The forecast called for a brutally dry summer. They were busy fining me for having my own water. Very soon, water would become the most valuable thing in this neighborhood. And when that happened, those violation notices would mean nothing at all. The highest level drought warning was issued at 6:30 in the morning. The town reservoir had reached its lowest point in 40 years, and for the first time, I felt silence spread across the neighborhood like a cold wind. The email from the county government was brief. Immediate water conservation was advised. Lawn watering was to be restricted. There was a warning that system pressure could drop if demand exceeded pumping capacity. I finished reading it, set my phone down on the table, and walked into the backyard. The ground had already begun to crack. The grass in front of my neighbor's house was still green, but the color looked fragile, like fresh paint covering rotting wood. I crouched down and pressed my hand into the soil. Dry, hot. The soft moisture of spring was gone. The hum of my well pump rose gently, steady and consistent, a metallic heartbeat in the still air. I did not panic. I prepared. Inside, I opened my notebook. Last week's static water level, pump flow rate, backup generator capacity. I checked every figure again, not out of anxiety, but out of habit. The habit of someone who had seen systems collapse because of one overlooked detail. That afternoon, I saw Karen standing in front of the central pump station on the east side of the neighborhood. She was there with two board members. They stared at the control panel, speaking in urgent tones. I did not walk over, but I recognized that look. Worry. That evening, a new notice was posted in the community group. The HOA requested that residents reduce water consumption by 50% immediately. "We trust our system," Karen wrote. "We just need cooperation." Trust. A beautiful word when everything is still functioning. The next morning, I turned on the kitchen faucet. The water ran strong, steady, unchanged. But around 9 o'clock, I heard shouting from the house across the street. A woman had turned on her lawn sprinkler. The water sprayed weakly, unevenly. A hissing sound, like the breath of an old man. By noon, more complaints appeared in the group. Low pressure, weak showers, washing machines flashing error codes. Karen responded to each comment, offering reassurance. Just a temporary adjustment, but I knew the signs. Pressure does not drop because of conservation. It drops because the supply cannot keep up. I stepped into the backyard and opened the lid of the auxiliary storage tank I had installed last year. 2,000 gallons of reserve water, full. I did not brag about it. I did not post about it. I did not mention it to my neighbors. I simply stood there, looking at the still surface reflecting the dry sky. That evening, there was a knock at my door. Not Karen. The neighbor across the street. His face was tight with tension. "My water pressure is almost gone," he said. "Are you having the same problem?" I looked at him for a few seconds. He remembered our conversation the week before, when he had doubted my well. I saw embarrassment flicker in his eyes. "My house is fine," I replied slowly. He glanced toward my backyard. He said nothing more, just nodded and walked away, his steps heavy. The rumors began to shift. Before, they talked about my violation. Now, they were asking why my house was unaffected. At the HOA's emergency meeting that night, Karen's voice was no longer as steady as before. I listened through the internal live stream. She said the central pump system was operating at maximum capacity. The incoming water level was dropping faster than projected. One board member asked quietly, though the microphone still picked it up, "Do we have a backup plan?" Silence. I turned off the live stream, because I already knew the answer. No, they did not have a backup plan. I had asked that question at last month's meeting. When I spoke about the importance of independent systems, they laughed. They said I was overthinking. Now, overthinking was the only reason water was still flowing in my house. Night fell. I stood alone in the yard. The sky was cloudless. No sign of rain. No sound of insects. Just dryness spreading through the air. I knew what was coming. This drought had not reached its peak. The reservoir would drop further. The central pump would strain harder. And when it stopped, even for a few hours, the entire neighborhood would fall into panic. They thought I was just a stubborn old man clinging to a well out of pride. They did not understand that I had once designed emergency water systems for places that lost power for days at a time. I understand pressure. I understand limits. I understand the moment right before everything breaks. I did not need to say much. I only needed to wait. Because very soon, the story would no longer be about whether I was approved. It would be about who still had water when the other pipes began to breathe out air. Water pressure across the entire neighborhood dropped to a thread-thin trickle on Monday morning. By noon, many homes turned on their faucets and heard nothing but dry air hissing through the pipes. And that same evening, the HOA sent me a formal hearing notice. Perfect timing. The community room was packed. There was no polite laughter like at previous meetings. No smell of baked goods and free coffee. The air felt thick, stretched tight like a drawn wire. Karen sat at the center of the long table, a thick folder in front of her. She wore a dark blue blazer, but her eyes were no longer as sharp as the day she knocked on my door. "Tonight," she began, her voice carefully steady, "we will address the issue of the unauthorized private water system violation." Unauthorized. I sat in the middle row, back straight, hands resting on my knees, calm. Karen began reading the violation notices again. $200 per day. The accumulated amount had now reached several $1,000s. She emphasized that the existence of a private well threatens the integrity of shared infrastructure. I listened. I did not interrupt. Then it was my turn. I walked to the front, carrying an old leather briefcase. The click of the metal latch opening echoed clearly in the silent room. I did not speak right away. I placed each document on the table. The county-issued well drilling permit. The technical report confirming stable groundwater levels. The email from the Water Resources Department confirming that my system was fully legal. I looked directly at Karen. "Please identify the specific clause in the regulations that prohibits a legally permitted private well." Silence. One board member flipped quickly through the bylaws. Pages rustled. No one found that clause. Karen tightened her grip on her pen. "The board has the authority to interpret regulations for the common good," she repeated. I gave a slight nod. "Then amend the bylaws through the proper legal voting process. Until that happens, I am not in violation." My voice was not loud, but every word was clear and steady. From the back rows, murmuring began. A man stood up. "My water barely runs. The shared system is having problems. Why are we focused on finding the only person with a stable water source?" The question hit the room like a blunt force. Karen turned toward him, blinking quickly. "We are addressing a separate technical issue. Separate." But everyone understood that the two issues were no longer separate. I looked around the room. I saw worry in the eyes of families with young children. I saw frustration in older residents who could no longer shower comfortably. I saw doubt beginning to creep in. They once thought I was the problem. Now they were starting to wonder who had failed to prepare. Karen decided to escalate. "If you continue to refuse to remove the well," she said, her voice hardening, "we will proceed with legal action." The room held its breath. I closed my briefcase. The sound was soft, but final. "I am ready," I replied. No challenge, no anger, just fact. I looked directly at the board. "I have opened a separate escrow account holding the full amount of the disputed fines. I have consulted legal counsel regarding property rights and state water resource law. If the HOA chooses to take this to court, I will seek reimbursement of costs and request a review of the board's enforcement authority." The room erupted into noise. Karen froze for a brief moment. She had not expected that level of preparation. In her eyes, I was just a quiet man living at the end of the subdivision, someone who preferred doing things on his own. She did not know I had managed construction contracts worth millions of dollars. She did not know I had faced legal disputes far larger than an HOA board. The truth was beginning to surface. I was not resisting out of stubbornness. I was resisting because I understood the law. Another board member leaned toward the microphone, unable to hide the concern in his voice. Perhaps we should postpone this decision until the water system stabilizes. It was the first time I heard hesitation. The meeting ended in mild chaos. No final vote, no declaration of victory, just shifting expressions. When I stepped outside, the sky was pitch black, not a drop of rain. The air was so dry it felt like sand scraping against my throat. In the distance, the central pump station lights were still on, but I knew that light was masking the strain inside. That night, I turned on the kitchen faucet. The water ran strong, steady, solid. While the entire neighborhood waited on a system that was faltering, I stood in my quiet kitchen, listening to the consistent sound of water flowing. They thought I was the one who needed to be controlled. But the tighter they tried to squeeze, the more they exposed their own weakness. And very soon, this fight would no longer revolve around bylaws or fines. It would revolve around survival. The faucet next door screeched, then fell silent. No more running water, only dry air pushing out like a dying breath. By afternoon, the HOA's central water system officially lost pressure. An emergency notice was sent at 3:15 in the afternoon. Due to a severe drop in incoming water levels, the pump station was temporarily shut down to prevent engine damage. Residents were instructed to store whatever water remained and wait for updates. Wait, a simple word. But when you turn on a faucet and nothing comes out, it becomes a frightening one. I stood in my kitchen, watching the water from my own tap continue to pour into the sink, strong and steady. The sound was no longer ordinary. It had become a luxury. Out on the street, the atmosphere began to shift. Doors opened again and again. People stepped outside, staring toward the pump station, as if they could see through concrete walls and find answers. The phone rang. It was the neighbor across the street. "Your house. You still have water, right?" His voice was hoarse. "Yes," I replied. Silence for a few seconds. I could hear his wife in the background, whispering anxiously. Their 2 grandchildren were staying with them for the summer. "We've got nothing coming out at all," he said quietly. I looked toward my backyard, where my auxiliary storage tank reflected the blazing sunlight. I had installed an additional backup filtration system last year, when I heard that the central pump station had been running near maximum capacity for 2 consecutive summers. Back then, Karen had said in a meeting that there was no need to panic. Now, the very system she defended had fallen silent. That evening, the HOA held an emergency meeting via live stream. Karen appeared with a tired face. The familiar sharpness was gone. She explained that the reservoir had dropped to its lowest level in 40 years. The city was also tightening supply. A resident asked directly, "Do we have any backup source?" Karen paused, just a beat, but it was enough for everyone to understand. "We are reviewing options," she said. Reviewing. Meanwhile, children in the neighborhood could not bathe. Elderly residents could not flush their toilets. Gardens that had once been lush began to wilt after only a few days. I walked along the main road that evening. The air felt heavy. I heard whispers as I passed. "He still has water. He has his own well." The tone had changed. No more mockery, no more blame, only a mixture of curiosity and hope. When I reached my gate, I saw Karen standing there, alone. No clipboard, no 2 board members behind her. Just her, and the streetlight casting a long shadow across the cracked pavement. "We need to talk," she said. Her voice was lower now, no longer rigid. I opened the gate, not rushed, not cold. She looked toward the backyard, where yellow light reflected off the well casing. "The central system could take weeks to restore," she said. "If the city does not increase supply, we will have to find an alternative source." I remained silent. She took a deep breath. For the first time, I saw clear hesitation on the face of the woman who once stood at my door with an ultimatum. "We've heard your system is still operating steadily." Heard. I looked directly at her. No boasting. No victorious smile. "Permitted. Inspected. Properly maintained," I said slowly. A hot wind blew past, carrying the scent of dry earth. Karen swallowed. "Is it possible that you would consider supporting the community?" Supporting. Words shift faster than water pressure. I remembered that first morning, when she demanded I remove the well within 30 days. I remembered the violation notices. I remembered the look of contempt. I also remembered the 2 grandchildren across the street. The worried families. This was no longer just an argument about bylaws. This was water. Supplying water to multiple households is not simple, I said. It requires a clear contract, legal liability terms, flow meters, commercial rate pricing. Karen blinked. Perhaps she had not expected me to have thought that far ahead. She once believed I was just a stubborn old man clinging to a well out of pride. Now she was beginning to understand that I had prepared for this scenario long ago, not for revenge, but because I have always believed in self-reliance. She nodded slowly. "We will discuss it with the board." When she turned away, her steps no longer confident, I remained standing alone under the streetlight. Inside my house, water was still flowing. Out there, the neighborhood was drying out. They once wanted me to remove my source of life. Now, that source might be the only thing keeping this place from descending into chaos. And for the first time, real power did not lie in a stamp or a bylaw. It lay in the stream of water running behind my front door. 3 HOA board vehicles pulled up in front of my house at 7 in the evening. No sirens, no flashing lights. But the entire street knew exactly what was happening. This time they were not here to find me. They were here because they had no other choice. I looked through the window and saw Karen step out of the first car. The streetlight fell across her face, revealing lines of exhaustion that had once been carefully hidden. 2 board members followed behind her, no longer carrying the confidence they had worn just weeks earlier. The entire neighborhood was now completely without water. The central pump station had overheated and was forced to shut down to prevent permanent damage. The city was prioritizing water supply for hospitals and commercial districts. Our residential subdivision was at the bottom of the list. I opened the door before they could knock. No one spoke immediately. There was only a heavy silence between people who had once stood on opposite sides. "We need to speak formally," Karen said at last, her voice no longer sharp or raised. "Not personally. As the board." I invited them into the living room. The air inside my house was cool and calm. The faint sound of water moving through my filtration system hummed in the background, steady like a stable heartbeat inside a body while the one outside was in panic. They sat down. Karen placed a folder on the table, but her hand trembled slightly. "We want to discuss the possibility of purchasing water from your system," she said directly. Purchasing. No longer requesting support. No longer talking about the common good. Purchasing. I did not respond right away. I let the silence stretch for a few seconds, long enough for them to feel the weight of that word. One board member spoke, tension in his voice. "We have done preliminary calculations. If each household is allocated a minimum daily amount, we can maintain basic living needs until the city restores pressure." I looked at them. The same people who once voted to fine me. The same people who said my well threatened infrastructure. Uniformity. Now, that uniformity lay dry beneath the ground. "I need to know the scope of distribution," I said calmly. "Number of households. Maximum daily flow. Estimated duration." Karen met my eyes, a mixture of fatigue and acknowledgement in her expression. "About 80 households, each needing a minimum supply for cooking and basic hygiene. We estimate a few weeks." A few weeks. I had predicted this scenario the moment I read the report about falling reservoir levels at the start of summer. I upgraded the pump, installed an additional storage tank, calculated the maximum output I could provide without depleting groundwater levels. They did not know I had prepared for this like a major engineering project. "Supplying 80 households is not a matter of opening a valve," I said. It requires metering systems, legal contracts, liability clauses in case of failure. One board member exhaled heavily. We are prepared to sign a contract. I looked directly at Karen. Including the cancellation of all disputed fines, I said. She did not argue. She simply nodded. That moment was the true reversal of power. Not shouting, not loud victory, but quiet acknowledgement. The man they labeled a violator now held the key to the neighborhood's survival. Yet I felt no triumph. I thought about families rationing the last bottles of water in their homes. I thought about my neighbor and his 2 grandchildren. I thought about the elderly residents living alone. The pricing will follow emergency commercial rates, I continued. I am not running a charity. But I am not exploiting anyone either. The rate will cover operating costs, maintenance, and risk. Karen released a slow breath, as if she could finally see a clear path forward. We agreed to negotiate. The conversation lasted more than an hour. There was no commanding tone anymore. No vague clauses. Only numbers, flow rates, and legal responsibility. When they stood to leave, none of them looked at me the way they once had. Not with contempt. Not entirely with gratitude either. But with respect mixed with caution. After the door closed, I walked into the backyard. The sky was still dry, not a single cloud. I placed my hand on the well casing, feeling the steady vibration of the pump. They once thought I was the problem. In truth, I was the only one with a plan. And in this world, real power does not come from titles or stamps. It comes from being able to stand on your own when the system around you begins to collapse. They signed the draft contract at 10:45 that night. The person who once demanded that I remove the well was now putting her signature on a request to purchase water from that very well. Before the ink had even dried, the order of the neighborhood had shifted. I did not rush to celebrate. I opened the contract once more and read each clause slowly. Temporary water supply for 80 households. Allocation based on a basic daily limit. Installation of flow meters at the connection point. Payment at the agreed emergency commercial rate. Full cancellation of all previous fines. No admission of violation. No admission of violation. That line mattered more than any number on the page. Karen sat across from me, watching in silence. Her eyes were no longer sharp like a blade. They were lowered now, heavy. There was fatigue in them, and acknowledgement. We will take responsibility for internal distribution, she said, her voice no longer raised. You only need to supply water to the connection point. Only need. I looked at her for a few seconds. There is no such thing as only in this situation, I replied. If flow exceeds safe limits, groundwater levels could drop quickly. I will set a hard cap. No exceptions. One board member nodded slightly. For the first time, I saw them listening to me as a professional, not as a stubborn resident. They once believed I dug the well just to be different. They did not know I had helped design emergency field water systems for regions that lost infrastructure completely after hurricanes. I understand the balance between demand and supply. I understand the cost of overpumping. After they left, I did not go to bed. I stepped into the backyard, turned on the lights, and inspected the entire system again. Main valve, filters, backup pump, generator. I installed an additional dedicated flow meter. The needle moved incrementally as water ran. Everything had to be transparent, not only to protect myself, but to protect the aquifer beneath us. The next morning, a contractor truck hired by the HOA arrived to install a temporary pipeline from the edge of my property to the main distribution line. The entire neighborhood watched. No one spoke loudly, but I could feel their eyes, no longer mocking, not quite admiring either, but quietly recognizing. The neighbor across the street walked over. He hesitated for a few seconds, then said softly, "I thought you were overreacting at first." I nodded. Now I get it. I did not blame him. Most people only recognize the value of self-reliance after dependence collapses. By noon, water began flowing into the temporary system. In each house, faucets produced that familiar sound again. Not as strong as before, not abundant, but enough to wash hands, cook, Flush. A collective sigh moved through the neighborhood. In the community group, the first comments appeared. Thank you. Relief. Someone called it a miracle. It was not a miracle. It was preparation. Karen posted an official announcement. The board has reached an agreement for temporary water supply with a resident in the neighborhood. She did not mention my name. She did not need to. Everyone knew. That afternoon, Karen came alone. No papers, no contracts. She stood at the edge of my yard, watching the system operate. When did you start planning for this? She asked. I looked toward the scorched horizon. When I saw the reservoir levels drop last year, I said. The shared system had no real backup plan. I do not believe in luck. She was silent for a long moment. I thought you just wanted to challenge the board's authority, she said quietly. I turned to her. I am not against authority, I replied. I am against blind dependence. A hot wind passed through, stirring the dry grass. In that moment, I saw the shift in her eyes. No longer confrontation, no longer arrogance, but a lesson learned at the cost of drought. When she walked away, I remained by the well. Water continued to flow, steady, controlled. I was not seeking victory. I was protecting my autonomy. And in a world where many people hand control over to systems and simply hope they do not fail, self-reliance is not rebellion. It is responsibility. Now the entire neighborhood was surviving because of a decision they once called a violation. And I know this story is not over. Because when a crisis passes, people forget quickly. But I do not. The first water bill from my system was sent to the HOA after 7 days of operation. The number printed on it left the entire board in silence. They had never had to pay for their dependents in this way before. I did not set an unreasonable rate. I calculated the exact operating costs, maintenance, equipment depreciation, and the risk of groundwater decline. Every gallon was recorded through the flow meter installed openly at the connection point. No estimates, no rounding, absolute transparency. That week's board meeting no longer revolved around penalizing me. It revolved around the budget, reserve funds, the ability to pay if the drought lasted several more weeks. Karen sat at the center of the table, staring at the cost spreadsheet projected on the screen. Her face was tense. One board member said quietly, "If we had a backup plan from the beginning, we might not be facing this expense." The comment was not directed at me, but it was an admission. I watched the meeting through livestream, not to monitor them, but to understand what they were learning from all of this. Meanwhile, my system operated without pause. I checked pressure twice a day, logged static water levels, adjusted flow when necessary. I enforced a hard limit. When consumption approached the safe threshold, the automatic valve reduced pressure. A few residents complained that the flow was not as strong as it used to be. They were accustomed to water rushing freely without limits. Now, every drop had a price. I did not argue. When asked, I gave one answer. This is the sustainable level. Gradually, the attitude in the neighborhood began to shift. People started talking about rain barrels, backup generators, the idea that they should not rely entirely on a shared system. The neighbor across the street installed a storage tank behind his house. Another family asked me about the permitting process for drilling a well. The irony was that the HOA bylaws had not yet changed, but the mindset had begun to move. One afternoon, Karen came to see me with another stack of papers. Not a violation notice. It was the official cancellation of all previous fines, exactly as stated in the contract. "I wanted to hand this to you personally," she said. I took the documents, light in weight, heavy in meaning. "Thank you," I replied. She stood there for a few seconds, then said quietly, "I believed that maintaining uniformity was how we protected the community. But perhaps we were wrong to treat difference as a threat." I looked at her. There was no longer a sense of confrontation. "Uniformity is not wrong," I said. "But there has to be backup. Every system has a weakness." The hot wind still moved through the neighborhood, carrying the smell of dry earth. The drought was not over. The reservoir remained at a dangerous level. The city had not committed to a full restoration date. But in this neighborhood, people were no longer panicking like they had in the first week. They knew water would flow each morning. Limited, Controlled, but flowing. One evening, I received a message from a younger resident. "Thank you for not removing your well when they demanded it." I read that message several times. I did not keep the well to be a hero. I kept it because I believe self-reliance is not selfish. It is responsibility to yourself. And sometimes, responsibility to the entire community. The second invoice was paid on time. No delay, no argument. The board began discussing amendments to allow independent water sources if they met safety standards. That was the true turning point. Not the contract, not the money, but the shift in how they viewed power. Before, power rested in stamps and votes. Now, they understood that power also lies in the ability to prepare before a crisis strikes. At night, I stood beside the well, listening to the steady hum of the pump. The sky was still dry. But inside, I no longer felt the tension of those earlier weeks. They once believed I was the one who needed to be controlled. Now, they were learning how to control themselves. And in the harshest drought in decades, the most expensive lesson was not the price of water. It was the price of dependence. The first rain fell after 6 weeks of drought, at 3 in the morning. No thunder, no wind. Just quiet drops touching the rooftops, like a reminder that nature had finally decided to speak. But at that moment, the entire neighborhood was still living off my well. 6 weeks. 42 consecutive days my system pumped water for 80 households. No major failures. No depletion. The groundwater level dropped, but within the range I had calculated. I did not sleep deeply during those weeks. Every night I woke at least once to check the pressure, to listen to the pump. Not because I feared a breakdown, but because I understood the responsibility of being the single source a whole community depended on. It was ironic. I had once been labeled the one who refused to follow the system. Now, I was the system. In the neighborhood, the change was no longer subtle. People began talking to me more, not small talk. Real listening. One afternoon, several middle-aged men stood in my backyard, asking about the structure of the well. They no longer laughed when I spoke about backup plans. They took notes. They asked about permits, costs, risks. I kept nothing secret. I explained every step. No showing off, no lecturing, just sharing. Karen was different. She became quieter in meetings. No more forceful declarations. No more emphasis on interpreting the bylaws. Instead, she proposed creating an infrastructure reserve fund. She suggested researching additional water sources. Some board members objected because of the cost. Karen said one sentence that silenced the room. "The cost of not being prepared is greater." I replayed that moment on the live stream and nodded slightly. The lesson had been learned. But the real change did not come from the board. It came from the residents. A young family installed a rainwater collection system. An elderly couple invested in a backup generator. One person even proposed forming an emergency preparedness group within the neighborhood. The mindset of dependence began to crack. I remembered the first day, when Karen stood at my door with a 30-day ultimatum, when she believed that eliminating difference would make the community stronger. Now, that very difference had kept the community standing. The rain this morning was not enough to immediately restore the reservoir. But the city announced that central water pressure would be partially restored in the coming days. That evening, I received an official email from the HOA. They outlined a plan to terminate the temporary supply contract within a week once the system was fully stabilized. No argument, no vague clauses, just a proper ending, on schedule. I read the email and stepped into the backyard. The ground was still lightly damp from the rain. The air felt softer. The pump continued its steady rhythm. I placed my hand on the edge of the well, feeling the familiar vibration. 6 weeks ago, they thought I was the problem. Now, they understood I was the contingency. The neighbor across the street walked over and stood beside me, looking up at the sky. "You know," he said slowly, "I used to think the HOA always knew what it was doing." I did not smile. "They are only human," I replied. "No matter how strong a system seems, it depends on the people running it." He nodded. "And what about you?" he asked. "Aren't you upset about how they treated you?" I thought for a moment. I felt the need to prepare, I said. Not to prove they were wrong, but to make sure I would not be wrong when a crisis came. He looked at me, his expression a mix of respect and reflection. That night, when the central system tested the restored pressure, I turned on the kitchen faucet. Water from 2 different sources flowed at the same time. One from the shared system, one from my well. The sounds blended together. No more confrontation, only choice. And I knew that even when the contract ended, one thing would not return to the way it was. They would never again see self-reliance as a threat, because they had lived through 6 weeks when real power did not lie in bylaws. It lay in the preparation of someone they once underestimated. The contract ended on a quiet morning. No ceremony, no urgent announcement, just an email confirming that the central water system had returned to stable operation. And for the first time in weeks, the entire neighborhood was no longer dependent on my well. I stood in the kitchen and turned on the faucet. Water from the shared system flowed strong and steady, as if nothing had ever happened. I stepped into the backyard, turned the main valve, and disconnected the temporary line that had fed into the HOA network. The sound of metal locking back into place was crisp and final. Everything returned to where it belonged. But nothing was the same as before. The first community meeting after the crisis was more crowded than usual. The atmosphere was no longer tense like in previous months, but it was not superficial either. People did not come to argue about tall grass or door paint colors. They came to talk about lessons. Karen stepped up to the podium. Her voice no longer carried the authority it had the first day I met her. She looked around the room and took a deep breath. "We have gone through 6 difficult weeks," she said. "And we have learned that a strong system does not mean a system that cannot fail." The room was silent. She continued. "The board proposes amending the bylaws to allow legally permitted independent water sources with clear technical standards." A wave of murmurs spread across the room. Not opposition. Agreement. I sat in the middle row, just as I had months earlier when my name was called out for a so-called violation. No one looked at me like a troublemaker anymore. After the meeting, Karen walked over to me. "You were right," she said directly. "Not about fighting us. About preparing." I looked at her. Her eyes were no longer sharp or defensive, only honest. "I was not trying to prove anyone wrong," I replied. "I just did not want to depend completely." She nodded. "I thought you were trying to challenge the authority of the HOA," she said quietly. "I did not realize you were simply protecting your autonomy." The real plot twist was not that I had a well. It was that they finally understood it was not rebellion. It was responsibility. A few weeks later, Karen announced that she would not run again for the position of president. No scandal, no overthrow, just a personal decision. In her final speech, she said one sentence that stayed with me for a long time. "Leadership is not about controlling everything. It is about admitting when you need to change." I left that meeting with a strange sense of relief. I did not win a battle. I simply held my ground on a principle. That evening, I stood alone beside the well. The air had grown cooler. Scattered rains over the past week had begun to soften the soil. The grass was slowly turning green again. I placed my hand on the edge of the well, as I had done throughout the past months. They once demanded that I remove it within 30 days. Now, the new bylaws protected its right to exist, not because I forced them, but because they had seen what happens when a single system collapses. I do not look down on the HOA. I do not glorify self-reliance either. I understand that a community needs rules, but I also understand that rules cannot replace personal preparation. When a crisis comes, you do not need to shout. You need a plan. If you have ever lived in an HOA community, you understand the feeling when someone believes they can decide what is best for your property. The question is, are you prepared for the day the system they manage no longer works? Do you have a backup plan? Or are you simply hoping everything will be fine? I want to hear your story. Have you ever faced an HOA that tried to control something on your own land? Did you choose to stay silent, or did you stand up to protect your autonomy? Share your experience in the comments. And if you believe preparation is always better than dependence, press like and subscribe so you do not miss the next stories. Because in this world, karma does not arrive with thunder. It arrives as a quiet truth when a crisis unfolds. And the one who was underestimated sometimes turns out to be the one holding the key.